Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat.
And there's this myth we're talking about earlier. The neoclassicals believe everything is done better privately, lower cost, more efficient, blah, blah, blah.
It made me realize that this institute wasn't about knowledge discovery. It was about money making. And the more I saw of academia, the more I realized it wasn't just this particular institute and this particular professor.
Many years ago, I was treated to this cheeky aphorism. Success equals results over expectations. 50 years ago, free market fundamentalists like Milton Friedman made a lot of claims of capitalism, successfully lobbying for privatization and deregulation everywhere. Universities were one target. Their public funding was stripped and they were commercialized. 50 years on, I'm going to apply that aphorism to compare and contrast the results in higher education against the claims he made. Before continuing further, I'd like to address those who might see this as a simple polemic against capitalism. I wish to address that sentiment with the following remark. Singapore experimented with privatization and deregulation in the 1990s. In the cases where it blew up in their faces, they did not hesitate to rip those policies out, renationalizing and re-regulating certain businesses and sectors to reverse the damage. Singapore is the top financial center of Asia and rated as one of the most business-friendly nations in the world. They aren't married to free market fundamentalism. And it is very clear that this has no relation to their competitiveness. Commercialization of universities has been a complete disaster. Graduate students and faculty everywhere know it because they live it. And not too long ago, Sabine Hassenfelder, who is a theoretical physicist as well as being a well-known YouTuber, chronicled her experience in today's academic environment. We can compare the picture Milton Friedman painted 50 years ago with her own experience, which is not unique at all. Cast your mind back to 1979. It's 12 years before the USSR will fall, and the US and the USSR are in the midst of the Cold War. Phil Donahue provides Milton Friedman with the basic complaint made against capitalism. And Milton Friedman equates capitalism with freedom and prosperity in response.
The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade.
Everybody is familiar with this equivalence, as it is still made today. Milton also slid in a pretty big ask with regard to his freedom argument, which is to say that absent a commercial environment, one is the victim of bureaucratic tyranny. The only path to freedom and prosperity is a commercial one. Thus spake Milton. With these three claims in mind, let's now turn to Sabina's experience and compare the realities of commercial academic life with the claims Milton made 50 years ago.
Here's how this works. If a researcher gets a scholarship or research grant, then the institution gets part of that money. It's called the overhead. Technically, that's meant to pay for offices and equipment and administration, etc. But academic institutions then pay part of their staff from this overhead, so they need to keep that overhead coming. Small scholarships don't make much money, but research grants can be tens of millions of dollars, and the overhead can be anything between 15 and 50%.
The overhead she's referring to, that would be the administrative staff. Institutional bureaucracy has absolutely exploded both in size and compensation as universities commercialized. And I wonder what the bureaucrats will be getting up to. I'm sure all of our academics are enjoying the greatest academic freedom and just compensation for all the value they bring to the world.
This is why research institutions exert loads of pressure on researchers to bring in grant money. And partly they do this by keeping the researchers on temporary contracts so that they need grants to get paid themselves, while the administrators who are paid on the overhead usually have permanent positions. But you get used to this kind of crap.
Wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. That's not what Uncle Friedman promised.
In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade.
And the overhead isn't even the real problem. The real problem is that the easiest way to grow in academia is to pay other people to produce papers on which you, as the grant holder, can put your name. That's how academia works.
In fact, what happens is you have universities that used to be happy with their own intake. The University of Los Angeles wasn't trying to get students from San Diego. Then you put them into commercial. They're all competing for market share. So they start marketing, huge increase in marketing costs. They have all these bureaucrats who are now involved in packaging, sales material for the universities. An enormous distribution costs. So all that stuff doesn't exist when you don't have private competition. And you're far better off having publicly funded universities than private ones. A few private make sense in some areas, but to privatize the entire system ends up in a disaster. And that's what we've got now.
Grants pay students and postdocs to produce research papers for the grant holder, and those papers are what the supervisor then uses to apply for more grants. The result is a paper production machine in which students and postdocs are burned through to bring in money for the institution.
Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. The only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade.
And I began to understand what you need to do to get a grant or get hired. You have to work on topics that are mainstream enough, but not too mainstream. You want them to be a little bit edgy, but not too edgy. No, it needs to be something that fits into the existing machinery. And since most grants are 3 years or 5 years at most, it also needs to be something that can be wrapped up quickly.
Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat.
The other thing that happened was that the more I saw of the foundations of physics, the more I became convinced that most of the research there wasn't based on sound scientific principles, and why that had gotten an entire discipline stuck. And naive as I was, I expected physicists to think about it. I expected rational debate. But that never came. No one was interested. They were interested in writing more papers. And that's what they need all these particles and other wild ideas for, to write papers, to get grants, to get postdocs, to write more papers, and round it goes.
It's obvious that commercializing universities has been an unmitigated disaster. It's inflicted steep financial costs in research and education and damaged their primary function. Can America really afford universities being Boeinged? Because Boeing can no longer design or manufacture airworthy craft, and universities engage in a facade of primary research. Arguably, these developments are themselves direct damage to capitalism. Boeing has shed its design and manufacturing competence to chase stock prices. I tend to think product-free capitalism as an oxymoron. And circling back to Singapore, I want to suggest that if they had no hesitation ripping out policies that didn't work, we should also have no hesitation ripping out policies that don't work, because I am old enough to remember that the inefficiencies in evidence, the dysfunction in evidence, were characteristic of the USSR, a nation that ran on ideology and bureaucracy rather than reality.